welcome everyone here on this real winter night. Thanks for coming out. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the Ukraine campaign of Massachusetts Peace Action. We call our campaign Ukraine, a Time for Peace. As we know from our experience, people have very different perspectives on this war in Ukraine. And our hope is that even given that situation, that there are more and more people coming to the opinion that this war has to end and has to end now. And that the way to do that is through pushing the idea of ceasefire and negotiations. Not everyone will agree with that, but we're hoping that many people will, and that as time goes on, and as this meat grinder continues in Ukraine, more and more people will come to that position. We don't, however, in person, have much interaction about what this war is all about. We've all seen a million webinars, but we hope tonight that we'll have a chance to engage together with our speaker, Stephen Kinzer. At the end of the program, I'll mention how we're running this campaign on Ukraine. We have postcards over here, if you have not signed them yet, to Senators Markey, Warren, and to your congressional representative. We'd ask you to sign one of those. And if you are going to any events or you know people that you think you might be able to get to sign these postcards, we're going to ask you to take some with you. There are a few other announcements, but I think what we should do is get right into the program. Most of us know Stephen Kinzer as a Boston Globe columnist, a columnist for whose pieces of writing we look on Sundays and sometimes other days to see what Stephen has to say about some really important issues. But Stephen has been doing this for quite a while, as some of you know. He's an award-winning author and foreign correspondent who has covered more than 50 countries on 5 continents. His articles and books have led the Washington Post to place him among, quote, the best in popular foreign policy storytelling, unquote. He was Latin America correspondent for the Boston Globe. Some of us remember those days. And then spent more than 20 years working for the New York Times, with extended postings in Nicaragua, Germany, and Turkey. Presently, Stephen Kinzer is a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. His numerous books include, because I won't read them all, Overthrow, an absolutely must book for people interested in various efforts at regime change over more than a century. Here you will find the real story behind Hawaii, behind Guatemala, behind these places, especially Iran, places we know about very superficially, but this book will help you understand the real dynamics going on in these societies and the interaction of those dynamics with U.S. foreign policymakers that led to the coups and overthrows of governments around the world. His book, All the Shah's Men, focuses on that 53 overthrow of Mossadegh by the United States, which was bragged about quite openly. The next book I'll just mention is The Brothers, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and their secret World War. A couple of good siblings. Then there's the true flag, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and the birth of American empire. And I think this is the most recent one, Poisoner in Chief. I'm going to stop there, but it gives you a feel for the depth of Stephen's engagement with these issues. And so, we want to thank you, Stephen, for being with us here this evening, and thank you all for coming out. Stephen Kinzer.
Okay, you're going to wear this on your lapel. Not going to miss anything here tonight. All right, perfect.
All right, well, thank you for that introduction, and it's wonderful to be here. It's great that Mass Peace Action exists and gives us a kind of a framework for some of the actions that are so necessary and make us feel like we at least have some voice. So I'm very grateful for the fact that we have a channel, and I hope we can embrace it and widen it so that more and more people will join us. We're at a quite bizarre moment in our history now. I didn't like reading the newspapers or the press even before this year, but it's just gotten almost unbearable. We have this horror movie double feature going on the world stage. As if the Ukraine war weren't bad enough, we have the absolute horror unfolding in Gaza. And you really want to turn away, but your mind won't let you, because you realize how much suffering is going on out in the world and how fortunate we are not to be in the middle of it. And then we also, I think, as Americans, always have this nagging feeling that we're not just observers, but unfortunately we're participants, directly or indirectly, in many of these horrors. So I'm going to leave Gaza for another night and another speaker and talk about Ukraine. That is a war that I hope we don't lose sight of as we are focused so intently on Gaza. And I'm wondering if one might even play into the other, whether the horror of war, as we're seeing it in Gaza, might awaken some people to the horror of war in general. I doubt that the Gaza war really is much more brutal than other wars. It's just that this time we're getting to see it. So many times in war, it's presented as something very sanitized. I remember the beginning of the Iraq War, as many of you do. All we saw was great pictures of enormous flares going up and huge clouds of flame over Baghdad. It almost seemed like a 4th of July celebration. Very difficult to imagine who was actually under all those bombs. That's the kind of pictures that we don't see. So let me talk a little bit about Ukraine. I was just saying to Cole, I still have the feeling that when members of Congress are railing about Ukraine and how we have to defend it for as long as it takes, I'd like to interrupt them and hand them an outline map of the world and just say, can you find Ukraine on this map? I think many could not, because Ukraine is more like a concept. It's not a geographical place. Ukraine means the idea of us bleeding our enemies and showing off how strong we are, and it might as well be anywhere. This is one of the worst things about proxy wars. I lived through one in Nicaragua during the 1980s. And when it was all over, I remember the leader of the Contras went back to Nicaragua, got elected to Congress. I met him there years later, and I said, I can't believe you're here. You wanted to kill them. They wanted to kill you. Now you're here together in Congress. But there's 40,000 dead Nicaraguan kids, and this country has been laid waste to. What happened? Why was that? And he said, oh, it was just that the Americans and the Russians wanted to make a point to fight each other. We got our arms from one side, they got their arms from the other side, and when the two of those big sides decided to stop fighting, then we stopped killing each other. Something like that is happening in Ukraine. The difference is that Ukraine has been a focus for American intervention for far longer than almost any other country on earth. It started right at the end of World War II, and it's gone on almost uninterrupted since then. As you may know, many Ukrainians were sympathetic to the Nazis as they fought against what they perceived to be Russia or Russian power. Ukraine has always been one of the world centers of anti-Semitism, and horrific atrocities were committed there. Many of the people who committed them were then rounded up and fled. They wound up in displaced persons camps in Central and Western Europe. And even before the CIA was founded, American security officers were going through those displaced persons camps, looking for Ukrainians, looking for people who wanted to go back and fight. Many of these were the people who had fought alongside the Nazis, and that was fine with us. They were the ones that wanted to go back. They wanted to keep the anti-Soviet resistance alive, and so did we. Right after the CIA was founded, it began one of its earliest operations, which was dropping commandos into Ukraine. We rounded up dozens of people, trained them in sabotage and espionage, gave them all kinds of equipment, and dropped them into Ukraine. Dozens and dozens of these, probably about 85 in the late 40s and early 50s. Almost all of them were immediately arrested and killed. The reason, as we later found out, was that the Soviets had a spy inside the security establishment. That was Kim Philby, who was calling up the Soviets and telling them exactly where all these poor people were going to land. Now, interestingly enough, that operation, which went on for years of trying to foment upheaval in Ukraine by dropping commandos in, directed by the CIA, had a name that you'll all recognize, even if you've never heard of the operation. It was literally called Operation Red Sox. I've done a lot of research. I've always, in the back of my mind, I've always tried to look for the explanation. It has to have been maybe a guy from Boston or something. Why not the Operation Dodgers or Operation Yankees? I've never been able to figure out. So if anybody can, you're going to solve one of the remaining Ukraine mysteries for me. So Operation Red Sox represented the beginning of America's effort to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Moscow. And that goes back, as I said, even back to the 1940s. The next project we had there in the 1950s was a publishing house. The CIA established a bogus publishing house pretending to be independent called Prologue. It was based in New York. It churned out all kinds of Ukrainian literature, which was then smuggled back into Ukraine, encouraging people to rise up. And as the Prologue motto put it, prepare a base for future struggle. In the early 50s, the CIA opened a radio station based in Athens, devoted specifically to beaming propaganda into Ukraine and trying to foment upheaval and anti-government activities there. The tapes were made in New York City, back at the Prologue offices, sent to Athens, and then broadcast into Ukraine. So you can see that the idea of using Ukraine this way as our way to attack Russia is nothing new. It goes back generations. Now, Ukraine became an independent country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's only been an independent country since the early 1990s. As it was becoming independent, the Ukrainian parliament passed a resolution. This was just before being blessed as an independent country, that said this: Parliament, quote, solemnly declares its intention of becoming a permanently neutral state that does not participate in military blocs. That was 1990, and 1991 Ukraine became independent. Now, I want to take you to an episode that happened not right near Ukraine, but in another country that members of Congress cannot locate on a map, although that's a very large group. And that happened in 1999 with the American decision to bomb Serbia because we believed that Serbia was mistreating one of its provinces, Kosovo. And we decided Kosovo should be ripped apart from Serbia and made into a separate country. Serbian leaders did not agree to this, so the United States began a bombing campaign under the wing of NATO. For 77 days, the United States bombed Belgrade and other parts of Serbia until Serbia finally had no choice. And the United States effectively created this new nation of Kosovo. At that time, the Russians said already that this was a great violation of international law and it was going to come back to haunt the United States. It was effectively a decision taken in Washington that a country in Europe was too big and shouldn't have a piece of it. And we would agree that that was fine if we could use military power to rip it away. So that was the precedent that we set in 1999. Let's flash forward now as we look at the Ukraine crisis to the moment when the whole crisis really began. And that was 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania. It was there that NATO declared its intention to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO as full members. Russian leaders were outraged. They said so at the time. They saw it as an existential threat. Nuclear-armed enemy alliance is going to create new bases right on our borders. It's not something any large power or any small power wants to accept. The Russians made clear in, I don't know the Russian translation, but it will be something like, ain't gonna happen. That was the line of the Russians right from the beginning in 2008. Now, we didn't pay attention to Russia's protests. That didn't have much effect in Washington because Russia just seemed so weak. Russia had not been able to stop the 1999 expansion of NATO, nor the 2004 expansion. We effectively thought that we had our boot on Russia's neck, and there wasn't much that Russia was going to be able to do. Now, right at that moment, in 2008, when this confrontation happened, when NATO declared it was going to take in Ukraine, and Russia said it's not going to happen, our U.S. ambassador in Moscow sent back a wonderful cable, which thanks to WikiLeaks, we now have available. And I want to just read you a piece of that cable. First of all, I love the title. Niet means niet. Russia's NATO enlargement red lines. That's the title. And I'm going to read you a few sentences from it. Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequence for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, war. 2008. And that U.S. ambassador, William Burns, is now the head of the CIA. Which gives me a little bit of hope that there's someone there who still remembers and understands this conundrum. We were leading Georgia, just like we've been leading Ukraine, down that nice primrose path and assuring them that we'll always be there for them. So the Georgian leader, just 4 months after the Bucharest summit in 2008, decided he would order his army in to invade enclaves in Georgia that were controlled by Russia. Russia immediately sent troops, expanded the enclaves, and of course the United States did nothing. So that was the first sign that Russia was not only opposed to this expansion, it was going to act to prevent it. Nonetheless, the United States continued its plans to make Ukraine a bulwark of Western power right on Russia's border. And that is what finally led to the 2014 coup. We call it the Maidan coup because it was centered in the Maidan, the central square of Kiev. Now, that coup was the result of years of planning. The United States had the National Endowment for Democracy and various other so-called pro-freedom foundations in there showing people how to protest, how to rebel against your government, how to organize opposition and upheaval and uprisings. And at that ultimate crescendo in the Maidan itself, the Assistant U.S. Secretary of State turned up in person, urging the people of that country to overthrow their elected government. She was handing out chocolate chip cookies to the Maidan protesters. It was the same time that there were great protests going on in Greece against the austerity program that the European Union was trying to impose there. And I sometimes wonder, what if the deputy Russian foreign minister had shown up in the middle of those protests and urged people to go ahead and overthrow your Greek government? We would have considered that an outrage. The Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, was famously hacked in her telephone call. She told one of her aides in that call, Yats is the man. That was a reference to Yatsenyuk, who was the American candidate to become the new president of Ukraine. And that's exactly what happened. And when the aide on the other end of the phone told her that the EU, the European Union, is not going to like imposing a president like this, her colorful reply was, screw the EU. Although I'm sanitizing her language just a bit. So that coup was successful. It was a coup in which the United States was involved. It overthrew the elected government of Ukraine, which was sympathetic to Russia, and replaced it with a person who was effectively chosen by the United States. Immediately after that, Russia responded by seizing Crimea. Crimea is an absolutely essential piece of territory for Russia. It's their opening to warm water ports. If that is lost, Russia's strategic position disintegrates tremendously. There's no way that any president of Russia could tolerate losing Crimea to an enemy military alliance, which is exactly what the plan was. And not only did Russia then seize Crimea, it became more active in Donbass and told people in the Donbass, which is the region of Ukraine that's closer to Russia, that Russia was now willing to support them in trying to obtain at least self-government. The next year, all the parties to this agreement in conflict signed a wonderful agreement called the Minsk Accord. The Minsk Accord provided for a ceasefire a ban on all heavy weapons inside Ukraine, an exchange of prisoners of war, and self-government for the eastern provinces of Ukraine while they would remain under the umbrella of the national government of Ukraine. So that was a moment when it seemed to me that the heir might have been going out of this conflict. But the Minsk agreement was never fulfilled. It was never carried out. And just this year, something happened which even surprised me. And I've seen a lot of cynicism in all my years covering the world. So Angela Merkel, France and Germany were the guarantors of this agreement. Angela Merkel gave an interview, the former leader of Germany. She had been a signatory of the Minsk agreement. And she told the interviewer, actually, we never intended to comply with the Minsk Accord. We never had any intention of doing any of those things. The whole point of it was to buy time so we could send more weapons into Ukraine. And then some smarty pants reporter in Paris dug up Francois Hollande, who had been the president of France at the time, and read him the remarks that Angela Merkel had made and asked what did he think about it, and he said, that's exactly correct. We all agreed in advance we'll sign it, but we won't do it. That was even shocking for me, I have to say. From the moment of the Maidan coup, we now had a president in Ukraine who would do whatever we wanted. And the first thing we started to do was to train Ukrainian soldiers. Every year since then, we have trained a minimum of 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers. 10,000 a year over the last 9 years. Obama was reluctant to pour weapons into Ukraine. He has a famous dinner meeting when he's being pushed to do so, and he keeps asking people, what's the huge American interest there? Why should we be doing this? President Trump did send in what he called defensive weapons. Other NATO countries did the same. And then NATO began carrying out joint military exercises with the Ukrainian army. Another thing calculated to poke a stick right in the Russian eye. In fact, I found this wonderful headline in the Wall Street Journal, which is 100% true. This was about at the beginning of the war when it looked like Ukraine was making gains. This headline over the Wall Street Journal article said, "The secret of Ukraine's military success, years of NATO training." So it finally did pay off. Now, let's move up to the era we're in now, the 2020s. It was quite clear that Russia had the reddest of red lines, as Ambassador Burns had put it when it came to NATO expansion. It was a moment when the war still could have been avoided through diplomacy. But instead, at the 2021 NATO summit in Brussels, President Biden doubled down on the 2008 promise. And he repeated, I wrote it down here, we reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member. That is what led to the beginnings of the Russian buildup along the Ukrainian border. It started in February of 2021 and it lasted for 12 months, right up until February of 2022. The purpose of that buildup was to try to show Biden and President Zelensky that Russia was very serious about this and to try to persuade them to change their minds, to change course. At the end of 2021, so we're now just literally weeks before the Russian invasion, Russia sent twin letters to Biden and NATO saying that he would only withdraw troops away from the border if they would sign an agreement that NATO membership was off the table and that there would be no offensive weapons placed in Ukraine. There wasn't much attention paid to that then, but I have noticed that just recently, no less a figure than the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has referred to this exact episode. And I wrote down his quote too. He's talking about Putin. He actually sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no NATO expansion. That was what he sent us, and was a precondition for not invading Ukraine. Of course we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO, close to his borders. That's the reason for the war, as stated by the Secretary General of NATO. And upon understanding that there would be no positive response, Putin said in a speech to the Russian parliament, "What are they doing or trying or planning to do in Ukraine? It is not happening thousands of kilometers away from our national border. It is on the doorstep of our house. They must understand that we simply have nowhere further to retreat to." Do they really think we do not see these threats? Or do they think that we will just stand idly by watching threats to Russia emerge? If the United States had not made the decision that it was going to bring Ukraine into NATO and then double down on it at the end of 2021, today Crimea and Donbass would still be part of Ukraine, and there would be no war in Ukraine today. So the Western narrative is essentially that Putin is solely responsible for the war. And you hear a lot of talk about his imperial ambitions. He's rolling across Ukraine, and pretty soon he'll be in Warsaw and Berlin, and it'll be World War III on our doorstep. There's absolutely no evidence for that. There's never been a comment or a document that suggests this. As a matter of fact, nobody would want to occupy Ukraine and take responsibility for that country at this point. I remember that old card game we used to play as kids called Old Maid, and the last thing you wanted to get stuck with was the Old Maid card, then you lose. That's Ukraine. It's a devastated country full of pensioners who need support, and every year since its independence, Ukraine has scored #1 on the corruption index in Europe. This is the country to which we are sending tens of billions of dollars in military aid. Today, occupying countries is over. I'm trying to get the Israelis to realize that. So, to say that the United States is principally responsible for the war in Ukraine is not to deny that it was Putin who started the war, and it's Putin who's responsible for the conduct of the war. Nonetheless, the United States relentlessly pushed forward policies toward Ukraine that Putin and other leaders of Russia had made repeatedly clear were completely unacceptable and were an existential threat to Russia, with considerable basis. That is a point they have made repeatedly. And the Biden administration had a chance to eliminate that threat of war by diplomacy and did not take that chance. What is the result? Ukraine has been turned into a charnel house. Casualties are in the hundreds of thousands on both sides. We are chewing through an entire generation of Ukrainian men. In the meantime, the battlefields have left that once verdant land that was supposed to be the breadbasket of Europe in a shambles and in a state of chaos. And this is a war that has the potential to escalate even further. We used to be afraid that the escalation could happen because Ukraine would prove to be such a formidable fighting force that Russia would be forced into a corner and might then turn, as Russian military doctrine dictates, to the use of nuclear weapons, then leaving the United States and other countries with a terrible dilemma. Now, it seems like the danger might be on the other side. It's clear that the Ukrainian onslaught is never going to materialize, and that the Russian advantage in artillery and in manpower is starting to show itself. If that happens, if it seems that Russia really is making advances and the Ukrainian army begins to collapse, what's NATO going to do? That's another chance for escalation. So we may not have seen the worst in Ukraine yet. So the United States is decisively committed to pursuing this war as a way to weaken Russia. This war has nothing to do with Ukraine. It's all about Russia. And you know, we in the United States have more than a century of psychological conditioning to believe that the enemy is centered in Moscow. So pushing that button reactivated something that's very deep in our psyches. So when I'm asked to speculate on why all of this has exploded, I like to ask two questions to people who don't agree with me. The first is, what is so awful about a non-aligned Ukraine? Ukraine is very well placed geographically and also culturally and historically to be a bridge between the East and the West instead of a battleground between them. I want to look back at another historical example, which I think would be a perfect model for Ukraine. It's something called the Austrian State Treaty. So after the end of the Second World War, there were troops of all the victorious nations occupying the defeated nations, and that included Austria. Troops of all the Allied powers were occupying Austria. After deals were made for all the other countries, no deal was made for Austria. The Soviets were insisting that it not become part of NATO and that it not become part of the Western Bloc. President Eisenhower was determined that it would be. This dragged on for 10 years. From 1945 to 1955, Austria was occupied by American and Soviet troops. Finally, Eisenhower broke down and agreed to the Austrian State Treaty. Under that treaty, Austria agreed it will never join a military alliance, it will never have foreign troops on its soil, and it will incorporate these principles into its new constitution. With that, all foreign troops left, and it's been a tremendous success for Austria ever since. This would be an ideal solution for Ukraine. But it would mean that the United States did not achieve its maximum goal in Ukraine. And that's the reason the United States is not going to accept it. So we're keeping the war going, killing thousands and thousands of more people, destroying the country more intensely every day, all to determine where is going to be the border of Donbass. It's really what it all comes down to. We provide the money, we provide the weapons, and Ukraine provides all the young kids to die. The other question I like to ask is, how would Americans feel if an enemy nation were to build a military base complete with airstrips and nuclear power right on our borders? What if China was suddenly seen to be building a nuclear base in Tijuana? Or Russia makes a deal with Quebec, and suddenly there are going to be nuclear weapons in Quebec or in Tijuana? Well, we might say, oh, well, Mexico's an independent country. If they want to let China put nuclear bombs on our border, there's nothing we can do about it. We wouldn't say that, nor should we. That's too much of a threat. The leaders of our country are elected to prevent that kind of threat. Any
who allowed that to happen should justifiably be impeached, just like any president of Russia who would allow an enemy military base to be placed right on his border would be deposed. One of the basic concepts of international relations that I teach to my students every year is strategic depth. And then I ask my students, so what is strategic depth? Unless there's somebody with a military background, I don't get any raised hands. But all it means is you don't want your enemy right on your border. You want something between yourself and your enemy. This is the whole reason why the United States took Texas in the 1840s. Mexico was only 100 miles from our most important port, New Orleans, through which all of our exports were flowing. Mexico wasn't threatening us. But still, 100 miles just seemed too close. That's why we did it. It's the same mentality that is motivating people in Russia now. You cannot tolerate your deadly enemy putting military bases on your border. And that's the situation Russia would be in if Ukraine joins NATO, and that's why it's unacceptable to them, just as a comparable fact would be unacceptable to us. So, where are we now? I did write this column a few weeks ago saying the war is just going to go on and on. And I did that for a specific reason. I wanted all the world leaders to read my column and then come to their senses. I don't know if it's quite happened yet. But some interesting things have happened in the last few days. The first is that the commander of the Ukrainian army gave a remarkable interview to The Economist, in which he said that the war has now become a stalemate. That's the word that he used. And added, there will be most likely no deep and beautiful breakthrough. Of course, the President Zelensky immediately rejected this, but there was a reason why he said that, and there was a reason why it came out in The Economist. Those things don't just happen by accident. Then, this week came out a statement from the White House saying that Ukraine will run out of weapons very soon if the Congress doesn't immediately pass another aid bill. We have spent $61 billion on aid to Ukraine in the last year and a half. Try to wrap your mind around what that means. And that's not counting all the other aid, which equals almost about the same amount. We have poured so much weaponry into that country that the stocks of the major defense contractors in the United States are skyrocketing. They're popping the champagne corks in their executive suites at Boeing and Northrop and Textron. So, do you get this sense from the White House that things seem to be in a difficult position? Now, the Pentagon replied to that by saying, we don't really know what the White House is talking about. We got plenty of weapons to send them for the whole rest of the winter. But to be sure that that new bill passes Congress in the coming days, the Biden administration arranged for Zelensky to have a video briefing today with all members of the U.S. Senate. And just in the ride over here, I found out it was canceled. And Senator Chuck Schumer said something came up at the last moment. He wouldn't say anything else. Always kind of interesting straws in the wind. Meanwhile, the political circus in Washington is also playing a role in this. And we're now in this bizarre position where the Democrats have completely unmasked themselves as the 100% war party. You know, when the first aid package for Ukraine was passed, just as the war began, there were about a dozen senators and maybe about 30 or 40 members of the House who voted against it. Every single one was a Republican. So that means Bernie Sanders, AOC, Barbara Lee, everybody, every Democrat loved it. And even more bizarre to me is that you're starting to see a peace caucus inside the Republican Party. And it's not just inside the Republican Party, it's the people that want to ban abortions and give everybody a gun and hate COVID vaccines and think that Biden didn't win the last election. Those are our brothers in arms right now. Really, the world turns. We have to open ourselves up to the coalitions that are out there. The people that are dying in Ukraine are calling out to us to do anything that's possible. And I think one of the Republican talking points on this makes a lot of sense, which is we have crying needs here at home. Think of those $61 billion when you're sitting on the T that doesn't move. Or when you're thinking of people that can't get health care, they're terrified to go to the hospital because they can't afford it. That way they won't be able to pay their rent. Whenever you propose something like free community colleges or Medicare for all, you get scorned with the answer, oh, where do we get the money for that? How are we going to pay for that? Yeah, I got $61 billion to pay for it. That's money that can only be spent in one place or another. And this is one of my complaints about some of the social justice and even climate change movements that have sprung up so inspirationally in recent years. I admire their work, but I don't think they make the connection fully enough between the projects that they're desperately trying to promote at home and the fact that our overseas posture makes it impossible to pay for those programs. You know, we have 800 military bases in the world. 800! All other countries combined have less than 20. The Pentagon itself has a position that we have 20%, quote, excess capacity in our foreign bases. But they can't close them because members of Congress won't even let the Pentagon do what it wants. The Democratic Party recently in Congress even blocked a Republican bill to establish an office of Inspector General to monitor where our aid is going. Since we're sending tens of billions of dollars to the most corrupt country in Europe, would you like to have at least one accountant watch it? No! That was the Democratic Party's position. So, this is not a civilizational war. It's not a war about democracy versus dictatorship. It's not about the future of human freedom. Believe me, I've seen this movie already twice in my life. Vietnam, Iraq. The whole future of the possibility of human decent life on Earth is at stake there. That's what we heard about Vietnam. And that's what we heard about Iraq. We have to stop the horrific forces that are coming after us. And everybody cheers. After a while, we become a little bit tired of the war. We realize that our allies are not the saints they were painted out to be. And we realize that the other side really has an army and is going to fight back. The idea that Russia would build on success in Ukraine to push into Europe was crazy at the beginning and still is now when we see the Russian capacities or lack of capacities in Ukraine. So we don't have a vital interest in this war any more than we had a vital interest in in Vietnam, or any more than we had a vital interest in Iraq or in Afghanistan. We only fuel the war for a reason that has nothing to do with Ukraine itself, in which we, as I said, have no real interest, only because we want to use it as a battering ram against Russia. In the media, where there has been terrible censorship of any dissenting view, we only hear that this is a kind of a holy crusade. But much of the world doesn't see it that way. We've got this, we have this propaganda beamed at us that there might be a few bad countries that are on the side of Russia. I mean, there's always North Korea and Nicaragua and Venezuela, but all the civilized world is on our side. But this is not true. Actually, most of the world is on the side that we're on, against this war. The only exceptions are the NATO countries, plus Japan and Australia and maybe New Zealand. That's it. The whole rest of the world is trying to stop this war. Now, I would like to place this also in a larger context, and I'll finish with this. Instead of thinking only about what we can do to end the Ukraine war, let's think about how we can adopt an approach to the world that will prevent this from happening again. First of all, in Ukraine, my recommendation is take our thumb off the scale, let Russia and Ukraine and European countries work out their differences among themselves. I would like to see the same thing done in the Middle East. We shouldn't be supporting any side. We shouldn't be sending weapons to any side. And once our thumb is off the scale, you're going to see a lot more openness to negotiation because the parties will be on the same playing field. I would like to leave Europe and the Middle East to their own devices. I'd like to see the United States focus much more intensely on China. Our relationship with China is going to shape the future of our country. We need to concentrate on building a stable and mutually productive relationship with China. It's the greatest foreign policy challenge that we have. It towers above Ukraine or even the Middle East in terms of global strategic importance. And I would like us to encourage Ukraine and Russia to try to work out some kind of a modus vivendi, which I think is actually a real possibility. And we should also try to calm down our panic about Russia and stop pushing Russia into the arms of China, instead trying to develop some kind of commonality that will help stabilize the region that we've done so much to destabilize. So the larger lesson of this conflict is that it's time for us to mind our own business. We are facing an existential threat in the world of climate change. We've got to put that at the very top before all of these geographical conflicts. It's time for the United States to reduce its global ambition. We don't need to maintain a global empire anymore. And in fact, we undermine our own security by doing so, because every time you pick a friend in a fight, you're also picking a lot of enemies. We should reduce our reliance on sanctions. We should try to engage peacefully with other countries, especially on the climate issue. And Ukraine is an ideal place, actually, for us to begin to start to build the post-imperial world. I'm very happy to be able to be delivering this message here in this room, because we're just a few hundred yards from the spot where George Washington took command of the Continental Army, and just a few blocks away from the building where Washington had his headquarters at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. I want to go back to George Washington's foreign policy. He had a great line in his farewell address, and I think it's one we should re-embrace. Why quit our own to stand on foreign ground? Okay, go George. Thank you. I'm not running for Congress, but somebody should. If there are any questions or observations, I'll be happy to accommodate them. What else is left to say at the end of that? I gave an interview a few days ago, and the last question was, in the face of all of this, how do you still get up in the morning? How do you keep going? Everything looks so awful. And I have to say, one of my answers is I'm so glad I'm a college professor. I'm around young kids all the time. And let me tell you, when you're 20 years old, you can't be a nihilist. You can't say, oh, it's hopeless. Nothing else is going to happen. These kids are just bubbling with ambition. They've got ideas. They're activists. They're going to develop the technologies that are going to reverse climate change. They're going to undermine the American institutions. They've got thousands of ideas. They're bubbling with enthusiasm and ambition. So I am able to be in a sort of positive frame of mind because I'm just coming back from campus. Maybe if you get me a few weeks into Christmas vacation, I won't feel this good. Sure.
You were talking about an example of what the United States put up with somebody. You forgot the example, Cuba. And that was 1,300 miles away from Washington, and yet we were ready to go to war at that point. And now we're complaining now because they want to prevent us from getting within 600 miles of their capital.
You're absolutely right. Cuba is a great example. You know, we have been caught in the Cuba obsession ever since Thomas Jefferson. In those days, it used to be said that Cuba really should belong to the United States for geological reasons, because Cuba was usually probably formed by rocks and sand that was washed away from Florida originally, so it should belong to us. Now we've sanctioned Cuba without a break for more than 60 years, all in an attempt to change the politics of Cuba. We've utterly failed. All we managed to do is to change the politics of Florida. and let me just add, it's a little bit off the topic, but talking about Cuba, I want to point something out since we just passed the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, or 60th, I guess it was. So I'm not allowed to tell you who assassinated President Kennedy. However, I do know there's about 5 different baskets of theories. So it was Castro, it was anti-Castro Cubans, it was the mafia, it was rogue CIA or security officers, or it was a lone gunman. There's one thing that all those 5 have in common: Cuba. President Kennedy was killed because of Cuba, regardless of what it was. If it was Lee Oswald alone, we know he was reading articles in the New Orleans newspaper that were describing how the U.S. was trying to assassinate Castro, and he wanted to save Castro by assassinating Kennedy. And all those other groups, whether it's Castro, the anti-Castro Cubans, the mafia, or the security apparatus, all had their motives based on Cuba. That little island has held us in thrall and hostage for so long, and although we've never managed to wreak our havoc on it, it's certainly done that to us. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering what you know that you haven't mentioned tonight about what's been happening to all those weapons that have gone into that country. It's difficult to believe that a very substantial fraction have gone elsewhere to exchange for those. Cohen, what do you know about this? When do you think we might get hit by some of those weapons that we sent out there?
So the question, if you didn't hear it, was about what's happening to all the weapons we're sending to Ukraine. I've seen some reports that they've turned up with drug gangs in Sweden and Holland. I don't know how credible that is. It seems almost impossible to believe, given what we know about Ukraine, that all those arms will be accounted for and secured safely in Ukrainian arsenals. I'm going to go back to what happened in Libya. When we overthrew Gaddafi, we had no idea how many weapons he had. We thought he had a lot, but by Secretary Gates' own admission, he had 10 times more than that. And the guards, the Praetorian Guard for Gaddafi, was not Libyans. He didn't want to have a Libyan army because he was afraid it might turn against him. They were Tuaregs from North Africa. Those Tuaregs had the keys to the arsenals. Giant truck convoys started pouring down toward the Tuareg region in Mali and Niger from Libya. And a lot of those truck convoys were attacked by more powerful forces like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Those weapons have spread all over North Africa. Every time you hear about Boko Haram kidnapping girls in Nigeria, or other atrocities all across North Africa, the coups in Niger, Burkina Faso, all based on security problems, those weapons all come from Libya. The other day I saw a little story in the newspaper, which was another example of why I hate the press. It was a report about it said a group of militant fighters attacked a police station in rural Mali and overran it and killed 5 policemen. Well, that story is worthless. That tells you nothing. I'd like to see every story that talks about jihadist violence in North Africa at least contain the word Libya. Why? Who are these people? Where did they get these guns? That we are still living every day, and people in North Africa are living every day with the results of pouring weapons into unstable places. And given the immense corruption that characterizes the Ukrainian military as well as Ukrainian civil society, I definitely have a feeling we're going to be living with those weapons in many parts of the world for a long time to come.
I'm curious, this question of Putin, it seems to me that Putin is a great target for the American political establishment so as to avoid confronting the policy errors that the United States has made that has led to this catastrophe in Ukraine and elsewhere. And in particular, one of the questions I have asked myself repeatedly, and I'd be interested in your reaction to this, is if, well, I'll say it for myself, I won't try to put it on the spot. If I were Putin and I was a leader but not unassailable, the Russian government is not this one guy, Hitler, who's in control of everything. There's a lot of political power beyond Putin himself. And the question I have asked myself is, would I have invaded Crimea in his position? And the answer I come up with is yes. And would I have gone in to try to shake up Zelensky, to cause him to start talking about some kind of reasonable agreement with Russia to not create a military confrontation? I think I would have done that too. And the question still is, could Putin have survived if he didn't take those actions to protect Russia's fundamental security? If they lost Sevastopol, I mean, this would be like, Catherine the Great would be rolling in her grave. So what could this guy do except what he did?
Well, don't try to get that point of view into any American media outlet. It is really, I think it's even worse than the run-up to the Iraq War in terms of a suffocation of outside views from the mainstream media. Well, I really agree with you about Putin and the way that we have used him. There is no Russia, really. It's Putin for us. Americans, we love enemies. We're always searching for enemies. But it's especially good when your enemy is not a concept or a nation or an idea or a force, but it's a person. We're a little bit like children. We need to have an evil figure. I mean, we had Gaddafi, Castro, we had Saddam, we had the Ayatollah. Every one of them was the new Hitler, remember? I like to retire that phrase. But it's so seductive to think that it's all one evil person. And actually, I think if Putin were to get hit by a truck or have a heart attack tomorrow, the next Russian leader probably would be more militant. The Communist Party has finished second in every election that's been held in Russia since Russia became independent. And the Communist Party leader has demanded that this be prosecuted. He doesn't like Putin's phrase that it's a special military operation. He gave a speech saying, this is a war, and it should be prosecuted like a full-scale war. So be careful what you wish for. I think you're right that no Russian leader could have survived allowing Crimea to be taken away from Russia and turned into an enemy military base. And I want to tell a little story about that. The institute where I teach at Brown brings in some very interesting fellows, they're called. teachers and people to have around who have particularly interesting backgrounds. And for several years, we had Sergei Khrushchev. We had Khrushchev's son. I'd pass him by in the corridor. It was amazing. And needless to say, I tried to take advantage of his presence, and this was one of the questions I asked him. At that time, the Crimea situation had just exploded. So Sergei Khrushchev had actually worked with his father in government, so he was with him much of the time and knew a huge amount, as he's written about in his memoir. So I asked him, do you know anything about Crimea? And how did Crimea, which has always been Russian, wind up in Ukraine? Why? How? And he said, oh, of course I know the story. I was there. He said, what happened was this. We were building a large hydroelectric project on and he named two big rivers in that part of Russia. We were building a big hydroelectric project. And one day, the person in charge of the project came to see my father. And he said, we got a big problem. Every time I try to do something, I have to get the permission of the government of Russia, the Russian province, and Ukraine, because these were all federations inside the Soviet Union. So there'd be effectively a governor and what we would call a state legislature. Each time I want to do anything, I got to get permissions from two bureaucracies. I can't deal with this. It's slowing the project down. I'm never going to finish. So my father said, oh, let's get rid of that problem. I'll tell you how we'll do it. I'm just going to make Crimea part of Ukraine. We'll call it like a gift for their anniversary celebration. That was it. It was about how to get the hydroelectric project finished faster, which made sense. That made sense because there was no difference if something was being in Connecticut or Rhode Island. It's all inside the United States. So it's all because of that Crimea wound up being outside of Russia and led to all the consequences that have brought us here tonight. Sure, go ahead.
The fact that, as far as I can tell, almost nobody seems to recognize or acknowledge, is that in August 1991, when Ukraine became a separate country, Crimea had a referendum and voted over 90% to be an independent state. So Crimea was not part of Ukraine when it occurred when it became a state in 1991. It already had a constitution by 1995 when the central government in Kiev sent military forces into Crimea to make it part of Ukraine. So it's an interesting piece of history that is worth keeping in mind. I don't know anything about international law, whatever shadow that we have left. But it's not even clear to me that it was a legal thing in international law, because Crimea had decided, according to a referendum, to be an independent state, and it was overrun by the central government.
That's right. The Ukrainians did not recognize.
It's a lot of interesting history here.
It is. Well, yeah, you said people don't remember. That's, Gore Vidal used to call us the United States of Amnesia. And I saw a book title. I loved the title alone because it could also apply to America and how we look at our history. The title was, "It was a long time ago and it didn't happen anyway." Yeah, in the back?
Yeah, do you remember the reset button? What happened with that? And one point that I try and raise when I'm talking with staffers from Democratic offices that really support the war in Ukraine,
Which is all of them.
yeah, which is all of them, is to use some of the words from the late in Obama's second term, which was prediction that if we escalated things in Ukraine, it could lead to war, and Russia would have escalation dominance in the region. So Where has Obama been on this, and why did his policy of trying to reset relations with Russia fail so badly?
I think Obama's really been a terrible ex-president. Compare him to Jimmy Carter and some others that have tried to do things. He's not impressing me as an ex-president at all. So what happened to that idea? I think it got lost in the warmongering of Washington, which is always looking for enemies and finding ways to fight Russia. And don't forget to go back to something we talked about at the very beginning, something you know very well. The power of the arms industry is immense. I really think the greatest factor in fueling the unrolling collapse of our political system is the influence of money in politics. Now, I lived in Europe for years as a New York Times reporter. I remember how Helmut Kohl fell from office. It was found out that a private person contributed money to his political campaign. A person who owned a corporation. That's taboo. It should be taboo. And let me, since I'm on the subject of fundraising, tell you a story that I'll never forget, even though it's a long time ago. A famous U.S. senator, who I won't name, but his brother was president of the United States, his chief fundraiser was somebody that I sort of knew. And I remember him telling me during one of those campaigns, he said, I asked him about how do you go about raising money? You know, what is it to raise money for a political campaign? I was just a kid then. And he said, well, of course, we try to raise money from as many people as possible. We want a big donor base. But actually, we don't make any money from it. Actually, we sometimes lose money because we have to pay so much to the mail order businesses. We just like to be able to say we have thousands of contributors. But actually, all our money only comes from two sources. Number one is people who support Israel. And number two is people who want something from the federal government. That's it. When you have a political system that puts people in power based on that, it's natural that when you try to pull back from militarism, you're going to run into a brick wall. You know, when countries join NATO, they have to build entirely new armies. NATO has a principle called interoperability. Every piece of weaponry, every rifle, every tank tread has to be the same in every NATO country. That's why the arms industry was so fanatically pushing for the expansion of NATO in the first place. Every new country, Poland, Hungary, they have to have whole new armies, whole new arsenals. It's a massive boondoggle for the American war industry. And I think that's a big part of the reason why Congress was so eager to pursue these wars.
May I make a
Dr.
comment
Benjamin.
about the Russian research?
Yeah, I want to try to get to a couple of the other questions. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture and also the responses to these questions. You know, like you, I'm a college professor, and my students also energize me as well. But I really feel for their future. I fear for their future. And I try not to express my pessimism and despondency about it. You know, you mentioned that the U.S. should stop trying to do what it does in Russia, et cetera, and really focus on mending its fences with China. How likely is that to occur? The way I see it is that the U.S. has been fighting this rear guard action to try to slow down and prevent its hegemonic decline, to use Wallersteinian terms. And it is going to pursue that, whether that means destroying Russia or next really weakening China, and then doing away with, you know, the BRICS alliance, etc. How likely is it that the U.S. is actually going to act like a moral and decent leader in the world?
Or I would put it a little differently. When is the United States going to act in its own interest? That's all I would ask. That would be enough for me.
Okay,
when would we just start thinking, what's good for us over the long run?
All right, so that's what people like Mearsheimer and Walt and yourself, of course, always repeat, but you
It
know,
doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen.
All right, so why? Certainly would be something new. Instead of our insane promotion of Taiwan, pushing them to arm and running warships in the Taiwan Straits, we should be encouraging Taiwan to try to see if they can make some kind of a conciliatory deal with China. The anti-China fanaticism in Washington is intense. And in fact, even those people who want peace with Russia, they say they want to make peace with Russia so they can be stronger to confront China. I think you're right that the major factor that's going to be happening in the world, and it's already happening over the coming decades, is at least the relative decline of American power. It's inevitable because other powers are rising. And the big question is, are we willing to accept this? Or are we going to rebel and strike back in a violent way to prevent ourselves from losing control? I think there are many people in Washington who cannot imagine the idea of a world that we don't dominate. We would think that without us, there'd be war and chaos and injustice all over the world. Well, look what's happening. And I share your feeling of intense efforts to try to prevent yourself from falling into pessimism, which is another word for, these days, realism. So I got the news from my daughter recently, she's gonna have a baby. I gotta be happy. I have to be. There's only one possible response. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking just what you're thinking. What a world that poor child is being born into. And I tell my students too, you kids should be really angry at people like me. Our generation is what left you with this mess. So don't forgive us. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering whatever happened to Germany. I mean, they just follow behind us lockstep, and they're just shooting themselves in the foot. Their pipeline got blown up. Their economy's going down the tubes. And what's in it for Finland and Sweden to lose their neutrality? What do they possibly have to gain? They had the best of both worlds. I just don't get why there's no counterbalance at all to Washington policy in Ukraine.
Well, the Germany situation I find very troubling. You know, the Green Party in Germany is now probably the most pro-war party in all of Europe. And I can just imagine Petra Kelly and the early Greens turning over, spinning in their graves. I tell you something, and this has to emerge for anybody who studies history. The idea that Germany is finally getting it together again and building up its army and getting some nice weapons and confronting Russia doesn't make me feel good. I don't like the idea of a resurgent Germany. It's never been positive before. Ever since Germany was founded in 1871, the idea that a country that's this big, that's right in the middle of Europe, becomes a giant military power is very disturbing. I saw the co-leader of the Green Party in Ukraine, near the border with Russia, wearing combat boots and a helmet. And I thought, how do you think this picture is going to go down in Moscow? With ordinary Russians picking up the paper and seeing the leader of some German party stampeding around Ukraine in his combat outfit. So I would love to see Germany revert back to the place where it was under Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, and I tremble to see unilateral Germany emerging as a military power in the world.
I wonder if you could give me your take on how Russia became a great enemy. My memory is in the early 90s with Gorbachev and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia, there were all kinds of articles about how Russia and the United States were great friends. In fact, we gave all kinds of aid to Russia, however it was used. And then, you know, Yeltsin moves on to it. And still today, looking back on it, the press looks at the Yeltsin years as the golden age of a democratic Russia. Putin comes in, George Bush looks him in the eye and says, this is a guy I can work with. But as soon as Putin comes in, you have this undercurrent throughout the United States press of something ominous is going on in Russia. And of course, it reaches a crescendo with the allegations of the 2016 election. But when did this cross over from Russia being the good guy to Russia being the most evil place on earth?
First of all, I think our period of thinking of Russia as a good guy was a small parenthesis in a long history of opposition and hatred. You can say it goes all the way back to the Bolshevik Revolution, but I have a book of political cartoons on my shelf, and I've got one from 1892. It shows the globe, and there's a very spry Uncle Sam looking very handsome with his hat on, reaching across the Pacific over Hawaii toward Japan. And then there's this hairy-looking barbarian coming out of Moscow, trying to confront him, emerging from Siberia. So that's even before there was communism in Russia. Now I remember right after the fall of communism, a big article appeared in Foreign Affairs written by somebody that we used to idolize, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, huge enemy, passionate enemy of the communist regime in Russia. And he came to the United States. We all cheered for him. Finally, he's come to freedom. After a very short time, Solzhenitsyn became very disillusioned with the United States. No spiritual quality to life at all. Everything is consumerism and individualism. He hated it. And he wrote this article. He said something. He said, the one thing I can't understand about Americans is that they hated communism. And that's why they thought Russia was so bad. Now that communism is gone, however, they still hate Russia. Don't they understand that it was the Russian people who hated communism more than anyone? And now that they're free, Russia has gotten what you want. It's not the government. Russia was always on your side. So I think the Yeltsin years were the period when we really had Russia under control. Yeltsin was going to lose the election in 1996. The United States massively intervened in that election and tipped the balance towards Yeltsin. That was because not only was Yeltsin privatizing the country and selling off all of its assets to oligarchs, but he was doing whatever the United States wanted. That's why we considered it the good old days. I think at first we didn't have a problem with Putin, as you said. Don't forget that at the negotiations after the fall of the Berlin Wall, NATO and Western representatives had promised Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. And Gorbachev, proving himself to be one of the world's worst negotiators, said, okay, thanks, that's all I need. It was like a pinky promise that you had in kindergarten. He didn't say, oh, great idea, let's write it down. That's the beginning of a lot of trouble. And I think the time that we began restoring Russia to its old enemy position was in 2008, right after the U.S. made its declaration in Bucharest that we were going to invite Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. Putin appeared at the annual Munich Security Conference. And I urge you, if you're interested, to take a look at his speech there. That was the ain't gonna happen speech. And that was when we thought, this guy is defying us. We just told him Georgia and Ukraine are coming into NATO. And now he stands up and says, no, we were not used to that coming from Russia. And we still aren't. I think that's what it plays into, but it's a very old and long story. I think maybe we okay, let's take one last question.
You have written an article about how this country interfered with the election. I've kept every one of your articles. I've kept.
Oh, let's see. They'll be used as evidence
And
in
you're
your
hitting
trial.
it right on the head. And I really love your stuff.
Well, I'll keep, sometimes I'm frustrated that I can't write everything I want in the Globe, but I'm so glad to have readers like you. Thank you for attending.
Thank you so much for that wide-ranging background, alternative interpretation of events based on history. So, thanks everyone for coming. Please, this is a time where the battlefield situation in Ukraine and the international situation of people talking about negotiations is a time when we can start to lend our voice in support of a ceasefire and negotiations. Maybe just a slight voice might, with everything else, push things over the edge a little bit. The situation is very, very fluid. Please keep paying attention to Ukraine. Please, if you know people that you think will sign a postcard that says you want our elected officials, you want them to support publicly a ceasefire and negotiations, please take 2, 3, 10 of those postcards, get them signed, and put them in the mailbox yourself. These are to Senator Warren, Senator Markey, and to your congressional representative. Whatever we can do now may have some effect over the coming year as all kinds of fluidity is now being introduced into the situation. Okay, so please, at least sign a postcard yourself. We've got 1,800 signed so far. We need more. We want to make a big deal out of this. Do what you can. And finally, I mentioned December 16th. We're going to have a wonderful concert, a holiday concert up the street at the Friends Meeting House. And we'll have some music, celebrate the holidays with some good, strong political music. Funny stuff, sad stuff, nice stuff. Okay? That's December 16th, Saturday night. Please take a leaflet if you are going to any events. Please take leaflets that give people at those events. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.